My name is Lila. I'm 41 and I've lived in the same quiet suburb outside Raleigh, North Carolina for the past 15 years. I used to teach high school English, but these days I freelance part-time, mostly so I have the flexibility to take care of everything at home. It was a Tuesday when I noticed the suitcase. It was sitting by the door, a new one, sleek, expensive-looking, packed neatly with clothes I hadn't seen him wear before. New polo shirts, a fresh pair of loafers, a cologne I didn't recognize. He was in the kitchen, humming, smiling at his phone. When I asked him about the suitcase, he barely looked up. "Just a guy's trip," he said, still tapping on the screen. "Don't overthink it, babe." That was the moment. Not the suitcase, not the trip. But the way he said, "Don't overthink it," like my brain, my presence, was just noise he'd learned to tune out. And suddenly, I realized I wasn't in the picture anymore, not even as a consideration. We met when I was 26 and he was 30. I had just moved back to North Carolina after spending a few years working for a nonprofit in D.C. I was burned out, living with my sister temporarily, and trying to figure out what was next. He came into my life like something stable and warm. He worked in finance, had a modest but comfortable condo, and seemed to know exactly what he wanted, which at the time felt like such a relief after a string of vague, half-invested relationships. We married 2 years later. Nothing flashy, just a quiet ceremony at a lake house his uncle owned. We both said we wanted simplicity, and for a while, that's what we had. A small house with a backyard, a dog, weekend grocery runs, Netflix marathons. I'd always imagined love would feel like a fire, but what we had was more like a calm pond. Predictable, gentle, something I could float in without fear. When he got promoted 3 years into our marriage, I remember telling him, "Go for it. I'll hold down the fort here." And I meant it. I was teaching full-time and juggling a few side-writing projects, but I scaled back without hesitation. I started managing most of the errands, the bills, the appointments, the little things that keep a house running. He'd come home tired, and I wanted him to rest. I told myself this was teamwork. We each took the role the other couldn't. But something shifted slowly. At first, it was subtle. He'd spend more time at work dinners. Then those became overnight trips. I told myself that's what being successful looked like. Then came the new passwords on his devices. For security, he said. The quick, "I'll call you back" when I'd phone him during lunch. It wasn't that he was cold or cruel. He still kissed my cheek when he left in the morning, still asked if I needed anything from the store. But something essential had gone quiet between us. Our conversations got shorter, factual, transactional. The warmth that used to sit between us on the couch now felt like a draft. And I started to feel like I was speaking into a void. Not because he ignored me, but because his responses were always just enough to end the conversation without inviting another. I adapted. I shrunk myself, little by little, hoping that if I caused less friction, he'd return to the way he used to be. I stopped asking if he was okay when he looked distant. I stopped commenting when he scrolled on his phone during dinner. I even stopped suggesting date nights, because the last few times I tried, he said he was just exhausted. At some point, I stopped recognizing myself. I realized I hadn't spoken to a friend in weeks, not because they stopped calling, but because I kept saying I was busy. I missed birthdays. I skipped book club. Even my sister stopped asking if I'd come by. I was always waiting. Waiting for him to be in a good mood. Waiting for us to have a good week. Waiting for that sense of partnership to return. Then there was the coworker. He mentioned her name a few times in passing. Nothing major. She helped him prep for presentations. Sometimes she'd text him after hours about work. At first, I didn't think anything of it. But one night I saw her name flash across his screen at midnight. I wasn't snooping. I was plugging in his phone because it was about to die. He said she needed help with a spreadsheet and brushed it off. I nodded, smiled, and went back to folding laundry. But something about the way he answered, clipped, careful, felt different. Like he was performing normal instead of just being it. After that, I started noticing more. He took longer in the shower, but came out dry-haired. He'd forget to take his charger, but still had a full battery. I found a receipt for a dinner at a place we used to love. He hadn't mentioned going. When I asked how his day was, his answers became big. You know, same stuff. Busy. And if I asked a second question, it was like I'd pushed too far. I started questioning my own mind. Maybe I was reading into things. Maybe I was tired. Maybe this was just what marriage looked like after a decade. Maybe I was just bored, insecure, paranoid. I went online and read articles about emotional burnout, about midlife marriage slumps. I tried to fix it quietly. I changed my hair, bought new sheets, made his favorite dinners on random Tuesdays. But nothing shifted. I think the hardest part wasn't the doubt. It was how alone I felt in it. How everything I suspected lived only inside my head. Because he still smiled. Still called me babe. Still kissed my forehead before leaving for work. But it all felt hollow, polite, like I was living with a very kind stranger. Then came the night I heard him on the phone, laughing. It wasn't anything obvious, just a soft chuckle through the bathroom door. I stood there, barefoot, holding a clean towel I'd brought him. I didn't knock. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, listening to the sound of my husband, being alive in a way he no longer was with me. That's when I knew something was breaking. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask questions. I just folded the towel over the rack and walked away. It happened on a Saturday morning in early March. I was reorganizing the junk drawer in the kitchen, the one we all have, cluttered with batteries, dead pens, old receipts, and forgotten to-do lists. It wasn't anything special, just one of those chores I do when I want to feel like I'm putting something in order, even if it's just paper clips and thumbtacks. That's when I found it. Tucked between an expired AAA card and a menu for a restaurant that had closed during the pandemic, a printed flight itinerary. Folded once. No envelope. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious that day. But the paper had his name on it, and I recognized the departure airport. The date was next week. The destination was Cabo San Lucas. That stopped me. He had told me he was going to Denver. Guys' weekend, he'd said. Some golf, some poker, nothing wild. I even remembered helping him find his old golf shoes a few nights ago. But this ticket said Cabo, round trip, 5 nights. I read it twice to be sure, and suddenly, I couldn't feel my hands. I sat down at the table. The hum of the refrigerator felt louder. The sound of the ceiling fan above me, rhythmic, indifferent, spun over a moment that no longer felt real. I didn't confront him. I didn't even move right away. I just sat there, reading it again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something innocent, something I could laugh about later. They didn't. When he got home that afternoon, I didn't say anything. I smiled, asked how his day was, kissed his cheek when he walked past me. My heart was beating so hard it felt like I could hear it in my throat, but I kept my voice calm. That night, while he was in the shower, I sat at his desk. He never locked his computer, said he didn't need to. We don't have secrets. I opened his email just to look. And there it was. Confirmation emails, hotel reservations for 2 guests, sunset dinner cruises, a spa package booked under her name, the same woman from before, the one he once called just a co-worker. Her name was on nearly everything. I checked our bank statements. He'd used our joint account for the plane tickets but moved money from his personal one for the resort. I scanned through the charges. Boutiques, restaurants, excursions. He was planning an actual vacation, a romantic one. And I hadn't even known he was leaving the country. Then I checked his calendar. We still had one connected through a shared app from years ago, mostly for appointments, family events. He'd forgotten it was still synced. That's how I saw it all, day by day. Time blocked off for massage sessions, golf, private beach dinner, even a note that said her surprise gift on Wednesday. That was the moment something inside me froze. I wasn't angry yet. I wasn't even sad. I just felt hollow. Like I was standing on a shoreline watching the tide take something away and realizing I'd never get it back. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just started collecting screenshots of the emails, photos of the receipts. I forwarded everything to my personal email. I printed out confirmations and stashed them in an envelope. I backed up the calendar. I needed the truth, to live somewhere outside of just my mind. The next morning, I sat with my coffee and opened a travel website. I had enough in a separate account, just a few thousand I'd tucked away over the years for emergencies. I booked a flight to Cabo, same day as his, arriving 2 hours earlier. He left 3 days later, suitcase in hand, same soft lie on his lips. Just the guys, babe. I'll text you when I land. I nodded, told him to have fun. That night, I boarded my own flight. When I landed in Cabo, the air was hot and sticky. I took a cab to the resort. Not the one he mentioned to me, of course, but the one from the email confirmation. It was the kind of place we used to dream of staying in. Oceanfront, private cabanas, everything white and soft and expensive. I checked in under a last-minute booking. Said I was there alone. No one asked questions. I spent the afternoon in the lobby bar, sunglasses on, watching. And then I saw him, wearing that new linen shirt I'd noticed in the suitcase, standing by the pool, drink in hand, his arm casually resting along the back of her chair. She laughed, leaned into him, and he brushed her hair off her shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was the moment the grief hit me. Not because I was jealous. Not even because he lied. But because I saw in his face a version of him I hadn't seen in years. Relaxed, playful, open. It wasn't that he was someone else with her. It was that he was himself. A self he'd slowly hidden from me piece by piece, until I no longer recognized him. I texted him from across the pool. "Miss you already." He looked at his phone. Paused. Then placed it face down on the table and smiled at her. He never replied. I sat there for another hour, watching. Not hiding, but not revealing myself either. By the time the sun began to set, I'd seen enough. Before, the silence, before the secrecy, there was a version of him I loved without doubt. He used to call me his calm in the storm. Said that when everything else felt loud and messy, I was the one thing that helped him breathe. I remember the first time he said that. We were still dating then, driving back from a friend's wedding. It had rained the entire way, and I was frustrated because I'd spilled coffee on my dress. I was sulking in the passenger seat when he reached over, took my hand, and said, "You being here is the only thing keeping me from losing my mind today." He meant it. Back then, he always meant it. In the early years of our marriage, we didn't have much money, but we had a rhythm. We were good at making ordinary things feel special. Grocery shopping became a Saturday morning ritual, and Sunday walks were sacred. On my first birthday as his wife, I came home from work to find a picnic basket by the front door. He'd packed everything himself, even tried to make chocolate-dipped strawberries that melted on the way. We drove to a small park outside town, sat under a tree, and talked until the sun dipped behind the trees. He didn't have a big speech prepared, just a quiet smile and a folded note inside the basket that read, "You are the best decision I ever made." I remember reading it twice, tucking it in my purse, and thinking I'd keep it forever. I did. It's still in the back of my dresser drawer. But somewhere along the way, that man drifted. Not all at once. It happened in inches, like a slow tide pulling away the shore. There was the miscarriage. It was early, about 7 weeks in, and we hadn't even told anyone yet. I woke up in the middle of the night with cramps and a sense that something was wrong. The bleeding started hours later. We sat in the ER together, holding hands in silence. I remember how tightly he gripped. Me as the nurse quietly explained that there was nothing they could do. We never told our families. He said it would be easier that way. Cleaner. I agreed, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I thought protecting our pain would somehow preserve it, make it ours, private and sacred. But after that, he pulled away a little more. He didn't want to talk about trying again. He became restless at home, started coming to bed later, said he needed time to unwind before talking. I understood. I thought maybe grief just looked different on him. Then, the following year, my mother passed. It was sudden. A stroke. I was the one who found her. She lived 10 minutes from us, and I'd stopped by to bring her groceries. I remember the silence of her house when I walked in, the way the TV was still on, but she didn't answer when I called her name. I needed him more than I'd ever needed anyone in those weeks after. And he was there, physically. He drove me to the funeral, made sure people stayed fed, helped coordinate the arrangements. But he wasn't with me. Not really. He was efficient, not present. When I cried in bed, he'd pat my shoulder. When I tried to talk about her, he'd nod but change the subject. I began to feel like my sadness was something to manage, not something to share. That was the first time I felt the loneliness of being married. After that, our home became a quieter place. Not peaceful, just quiet. We still did things together, but they lost their spark. He started working later hours, taking solo weekend resets, going to networking events that seemed to multiply every month. 2 months ago, on my birthday, I woke up to an empty kitchen. He had already left for a work retreat and sent a text that morning. "Happy birthday, babe. Let's celebrate when I'm back." No flowers, no card, no voicemail. Just a sentence typed while walking through an airport, probably. That night, I sat alone at our kitchen table with takeout and a glass of wine, staring at the picnic note from all those years ago. Still tucked in the drawer, still folded neatly. It looked like a message from someone else entirely, like it belonged to another version of us that no longer existed. Somewhere between the silence and the forgotten birthdays, I had stopped recognizing the shape of our marriage. I still folded his laundry. I still asked about his day. But I no longer felt welcome in his world. I wasn't a partner anymore, just a quiet presence in the background, performing roles, keeping the house running, smiling for the sake of keeping things smooth. I began to notice how careful I'd become, how I avoided asking too many questions so I wouldn't seem insecure, how I stopped initiating affection because I didn't want to be rejected, how I filtered my own feelings to avoid being too much. I'd become a version of myself built for surviving, not for living. And it hit me. Maybe I wasn't just grieving the affair. Maybe I'd been grieving our relationship for years. Not just the betrayal, but the slow erosion of something I once believed was unshakable. The daily moments that once felt sacred had become silent, disconnected rituals, like washing dishes beside someone who had already left the table. I didn't confront him that night. After watching them at the pool, I went back to my room. I kept the lights off, sat on the edge of the bed with the curtains open, letting the ocean breeze wash through the space. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, only that I wouldn't give him a scene. I wouldn't become the emotional footnote in his story. I wanted him to see me, not my pain. Me. The next evening, I waited in the resort's rooftop restaurant. Not at his table. 3 tables away near the railing where I could see the whole space without being noticed. I wore a white sundress. Nothing showy, just quiet and deliberate, like everything else I'd planned. They walked in 10 minutes. Later, laughing, she held onto his arm like it belonged to her. He leaned into her as if there was no guilt in his body. Their conversation was light, familiar. He ordered for both of them. She didn't seem surprised by anything. No hesitation, no edge. This wasn't new for them. This was comfort. This was routine. I didn't eat. I sipped one drink, then another. I watched the sun slip lower over the water. When they toasted to finally taking time for us, I felt something in me shift. Not break, not crack, just shift. They finished their meal slowly, unaware. I stood up before they could leave and exited quietly. No scene, no confrontation. No headlines, just me, walking back into the evening with something decided. The next morning, I woke early, packed my things with practiced calm. I printed the screenshots I'd saved, the receipts, the reservation confirmations, the cloud, calendar export. I placed them in a plain white envelope and wrote his name on the front. Then I went down to the front desk. I asked the woman behind the counter to hand it to him upon check-in. She didn't ask questions. I thanked her and walked to the cafe. Knew his routine. Knew he liked coffee first thing. Knew he'd stop in before heading out for the day. I waited in the corner booth, facing the entrance. An hour passed, then another. And then he walked in. He didn't see me right away. He looked distracted, maybe hungover. Then he spotted me. He stopped mid-step. I could see it all in his face. The flicker of recognition, then panic, then confusion. He walked over slowly, cautiously, as if approaching something dangerous. "Lila?" he asked, almost under his breath. Didn't stand. I didn't look up fully. I just slid the second envelope across the table, a duplicate of the one at the front desk, and said, quietly, "I think you should read this." He looked down at it, then back at me. "Lila, it's not what you think. What you think." That's the first sentence every man rehearses. I let it sit there in the air. I didn't respond. He opened the envelope. His eyes scanned the papers, the dates, the confirmations, the receipts. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped. Through. Then came the excuses. It was just a phase. It didn't mean anything. I didn't know how to talk to you anymore. You've been so distant. All those practiced lines meant to soften the edges of a hard truth. I didn't say anything for a while. Then finally, I looked at him. "This isn't about her," I said. He blinked. "What?" "It's not about her," I repeated. "It's about how long you let me live in the dark." His mouth opened slightly, but I could tell he didn't have a response. Not a real one. I stood. He reached out, reflexively, but I stepped back. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. I just didn't want his hand on mine. "I'm not staying," I told him. "Don't follow me." And I walked out of that cafe like I was walking out of a chapter, one I'd stayed in far too long. I didn't stay the night. I took a cab straight to the airport and flew home on a red-eye, silent the entire ride. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I just watched the clouds pass the window hour by hour, letting go of what I thought marriage was supposed to be. When I got back, I didn't go home. I had already arranged to sublet a small apartment nearby, nothing special but mine. I moved in the next morning, left no note, no message. I didn't block his number, but I didn't respond to his calls either. I called a lawyer that week, quietly, filed for divorce. No drama, no announcement, no social media hints. I let the paperwork do the speaking. It arrived at our his and house 2 weeks later, while he was still sending flowers and long texts filled with promises. He asked to meet, said he wanted to explain, said he'd go to therapy, that he didn't know how far gone things were. I didn't respond right away. I gave myself space to breathe, to exist without being accountable for his feelings. We finally did sit down. Weeks later, he looked tired, desperate. He wore the same cologne from the trip. It made my stomach turn. He talked for 10 minutes straight. I listened, and when he was done, I said this. I stayed for a long time after you stopped seeing me. I stayed even when you made me feel small. I stayed through your silence, your distance, your half-hearted affection, because I thought marriage meant holding on no matter what. But what you did, it wasn't just cheating. You let me grieve alone. You let me live beside you like I didn't matter. You made me invisible. He didn't argue. He just sat there. And for once, he really listened. I'm not angry, I said. But it's too late for the kind of rescue you're offering. He asked me if there was any chance. I told him no. Not out of cruelty, but because I owed myself honesty now, more than I owed him hope. And then I left. No slamming doors, no screaming. Just quiet, deliberate steps toward a life I didn't have to shrink to fit into. It's been 8 months since I left. I live in a small apartment now. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor. Nothing fancy, but full of light. I picked it because the balcony faces west, and every evening I sit outside with a cup of tea, letting the day unwind itself. It's quiet here. No one knocks unless I've invited them. No one asks what time dinner will be. I never realized how much of my life had been measured by someone else's rhythm until I stepped into my own. At first, it was strange. Not lonely, just unfamiliar. Waking up without needing to check anyone else's calendar. Cooking whatever I wanted, deciding things without discussion. I kept thinking I'd feel empty, but what I felt was space. Space I hadn't had in years. I started freelancing again. Small writing gigs, mostly editing and tutoring. It doesn't pay much, but it's steady. And for the first time in a long time, I get to choose what I say yes to. I also reconnected with someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Marissa, a friend from university. She reached out after hearing through someone that I'd moved. We met for coffee. I told her part of the story. She didn't ask for details. Just hugged me, laughed at my old jokes like no time had passed, and asked if I wanted to join her book club. I did. It's funny how easily pieces of your old self come back when no one is asking you to disappear. He still reaches out now and then. At first, it was texts. Short ones, hope you're okay. Then longer ones, I made a mistake. I miss you. I didn't realize what I had. Sometimes there was guilt, sometimes nostalgia, sometimes just silence between the lines. I didn't reply. He called once a few months ago. I let it go to voicemail. He sounded tired, said he was sorry again, that he hoped I was finding peace, that he still dreamed about us. I didn't delete it. I didn't listen to it twice either. Then came the letter, a real one, handwritten, 3 pages. He wrote about the trip, about how seeing me that day made him feel like he was looking at his own consequences. He said he understood now, that the affair wasn't the worst part, that the worst part was how long he let me fade, how long he pretended not to notice. He said I was still the kindest person he'd ever known. I folded the letter, placed it in a drawer I no longer open. Not because I'm angry, not because I want revenge, but because I no longer need that version of closure. A few nights ago, I sat on my balcony as the sky shifted from gold to deep purple. There was a breeze, the kind that carries the smell of summer even though it's barely spring. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who said I do with stars in her eyes, who believed that love meant endurance, that if you held on long enough, it would be enough to fix everything. And I thought about the woman I am now. She doesn't need to be rescued. She doesn't need to be chosen. She doesn't need to prove that she was ever enough, because she's finally learned that being enough was never the problem. Being unseen was. I didn't catch him to win him back. I caught him so I could stop losing myself. And that's where the story ends, not with revenge, not with rage, just with peace, quiet, simple, mine, mine.